I am Andy Grotto. As Brian said, I direct the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. And before coming to Stanford 3 years ago now, I was the senior director for cyber policy on the National Security Council, a position I held in both this administration and the previous administration. I guess, before that, I was, kind of a prototypical DC swamp creature. I spent time on the Hill, other parts of the executive branch, in the DC think tank world. And, I liked the swamp, but I also love being at the farm. So I'm really excited to be at Stanford. I'm going to share a presentation with you, and hopefully let me get this going here and just see if, make sure you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to play this. And can everyone see this? Someone could just give me a thumbs up in the using that functionality or some other indication. Or better yet, I will just go until someone tells me that this is not showing up. Great, okay, I see it. So I see someone said that they can see it, so thank you. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of history for kind of where we are, how we got to where we are today, and try to look ahead then to some of the actions that I think the next administration, whether it's a second Trump term or a first Biden term, will need to consider in this vast and growing domain of cyber policy. So I want to start by sort of, whoops, sorry. So I think the problem we face today is at a high level, I think we've got a failed vision in the United States for how to govern digital risks and opportunities. And you see this across domains such as cybersecurity, where despite vast amounts of resources invested by some sectors, where you have other sectors that lag far behind, massive disparities in resilience, to me suggests that we are still not where we need to be as a country when it comes to cybersecurity, whether that's critical infrastructure or on the consumer side of things. Data protection remains a real problem in the United States. It seems like every other week, there's another data breach that makes the front pages, despite data breach transparency laws in the United States, along with Europe's general data protection regulation, hasn't seemed to have a huge impact yet on resilience against data protection. We're seeing obviously a big backlash against many of the social media platforms for being sources and distribution points for all sorts of propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, which has prompted new looks at their legal immunities. We have our fair share of international problems, not least of which is China, which we see manifested in recent sanctions against TikTok and WeChat. There's mounting anxiety in the US, particularly in Washington, D.C., about the future of the United States the future ability of the United States to compete globally with China, in particular when it comes to cutting edge technologies. And as we saw today with the Department of Justice's announcement of an antitrust investigation against Google, clearly there are competition, unanswered questions about competition that linger. So how did we get here? I want to start by putting this quote up for you. This comes from kind of a landmark report that the Clinton administration put out in 1997. It's called a Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, that really lays out, more than 20 years ago, the vision for tech that I think has more or less persisted until quite recently. It's this idea that that the internet is different than most other sectors that impact the economy in significant ways, whether it's finance or telecommunications or energy, and that a non-regulatory market-oriented approach is the way to go. Now that was 1997. Over the next 10 years, we start to see more and more data breaches happen. And building on this idea of a non-regulatory approach, we see this proliferation, beginning in California, of state data breach laws, with the theory being that if there was more transparency in the marketplace about data breach laws, victims and consumers would demand more data protection, and that would result in sort of a market response in the direction of more investment in protecting data. But we haven't really seen evidence of that. Meanwhile, while state laws proliferated, there's still no federal law. During this period of time, in the 10 years since 1997, cyber espionage and cyber crime are on the rise. We also see the emergence of very threatening nation-state activity. Buckshot Yankee is one. For fellow cyber nerds out there, you know what that is. For those who don't, this was a Russian intrusion into the Department of Defense's sensitive systems that really served as a wake-up call for the U.S. government to begin to really try to get its cyber house in order. The main answer at the time, circa 2007, 2008, was this initiative called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, CNCI. It's a bit of a misnomer because it was neither comprehensive nor national. It really focused primarily on investing a lot of money into NSA's SIGINT capability, SIGINT, signals intelligence capability. Meanwhile, around this time, again, and end of the second term of the Bush administration, there's this dawning awareness of major vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, awareness driven in part by the development of offensive capabilities by the U.S. government. As we begin to look for opportunities on the offensive side, we also gained more appreciation about our own vulnerabilities. And then, of course, this is the period of time when social media really began to enter the mainstream. So, more in essence, at the beginning of President Obama's first term, I want to provide a little bit of the ideological context at the time. So, at the time, the center left had this perspective on Silicon Valley, going back to this 1997 framework with the quote that I mentioned, that really had these twin presumptions behind it. One was that there was this dominant view in the center left that tech companies acted in good faith, that their leadership and ultimately their products aligned with center left progressive values. At the same time, there was this presumption of extraordinary competence on the part of big tech, which you go back. I mean, the innovations even today. There's obviously still a ton of innovation happening, but particularly some 10 years ago, this whole world was a lot more foreign to policymakers than it is today. And there was a lot of awe and admiration for the amount of innovation coming out of Silicon Valley, and that sort of translated into this assumption that, gosh, these people really, really, really know what they're doing, right? So, twin presumptions on the left: presumption of good faith and a presumption of competence. Then on the center right, you have the sort of traditional anti-government sentiment, and together, these created a very strong laissez-faire environment for tech. Moving into Obama's first term. Now, as these problems began to emerge, the first shot at answering them came in 2011 when the Obama administration issued a legislative proposal to deal with some of these cyber issues, along with some parallel initiatives, both on the budget side of things as well as the DoD side of things, to build capacity in the law enforcement and intelligence community, and also restructure DoD into Cyber Command. On the legislative front, the administration proposed a pretty modest but regulatory approach to critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Its legislative proposal would have created some new processes to streamline the ability of the private sector to share information about cyber threats with the federal government. There's also a proposal to bolster the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which many of you know is the Anti-Hacking Act, Section 1030. So that was the initial answer. The Senate, and so if you go back to 2011, the House by this time was under Republican control. The Senate was under Democratic control. The House firmly rejected the idea of any new regulatory authority for DHS in this case to deal with cybersecurity risks and critical infrastructure. The Senate, meanwhile, proposed a parallel approach to critical infrastructure regulation, but discovered pretty quickly that as you may know, you need 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate, and there was just not enough political support, especially among Republicans, to move forward with a regulatory approach to critical infrastructure. And so the negotiators, and I should also say for your all's background, I was on the Hill at the time and deeply involved in these negotiations. So a hard pivot was made from this regulatory approach to critical infrastructure to going all in on a voluntary approach, essentially allowing industry to develop, in partnership with the government, a framework for managing critical cyber risks to critical infrastructure, and that if companies use that framework, they would receive a liability protection, specifically a protection against punitive damages. There was information sharing legislation that built on the Obama administration's proposal to increase private to government sharing, to also include private to private sharing. There as well, you see this idea that armed with the right threat information, the critical infrastructure will have a strong enough market incentive to sort of do the right thing when it comes to mitigating cyber risk. So in both cases, right, the voluntary framework and this idea about information sharing both really show this laissez-faire, this idea that the market is capable of supplying enough incentive for private organizations to invest appropriate resources into mitigating cyber risks. There are proposals to bolster the CFAA, build FBI capacity, restructure DoD, continue the build out of NSA SIGINT capability. All of these also carry forward. Now, unfortunately, much of this fell short in the Senate, so in particular, when the legislation that had this voluntary framework with liability protections and the information sharing provisions went to the Senate floor, a pretty remarkable thing happened. We had 80-something votes. So I should back up. Procedurally in the Senate, there's typically 3 votes. There's a motion to proceed to a bill. That's a 60-vote threshold. There's a motion to get off the bill. That's another 60-vote threshold. And then there's a vote, on final passage, which is the straight majority. Right, so 3 votes. So the first vote, we had 80-something votes for this approach, and usually it's a pretty good sign of things to come. We thought we actually might be able to get enough support in the Senate to pass this law. The day between that vote and the next vote, the cloture vote, the next 60-vote threshold vote to get to the majority vote, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which as many of you know, represents many American businesses in Washington. It's also a super PAC closely allied with conservative and Republican political candidates, issued a notice to all members of the Senate that said they would score how they voted in the next cloture vote in their how they voted scorecard, which has a huge amount of influence, particularly in conservative politics, because it's essentially a rating by the Chamber of Commerce for how business friendly or not a member of Congress is. And at that time, much as it is today, the biggest challenge for many Republicans when it came to their electoral prospects was not a Democrat, but a primary challenge from the right. So what ended up happening is this move to score the next vote caused many Republicans to get cold feet, and they ended up voting against it. And so the bill died before going to a final vote. And so this was in July of 2012, just months before the election. Of course, Obama wins a second term, and after the experience of the preceding year, where not only did a regulatory approach fail, but even a light touch voluntary approach couldn't get through the Congress, the Obama administration essentially tried to do as much of that as it could through executive action. And so President Obama in February of 2013 signed this executive order 13636 that set in motion the process to develop the NIST, the now famous NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, what's interesting about this move is, if you're the Chamber of Commerce, you actually ended up worse off for your members under this approach, because if you'll recall, in the original bill, there were liability protections, but it's not possible to give liability protections like this through executive action. And so what ended up coming into being was a voluntary framework with no liability protections. The information sharing provisions were eventually passed in 2015, signed by President Obama in December of 2015. FBI, if you've tracked FBI's growth in this domain over the past 10 years, they've made huge strides, particularly going into the second term in terms of their ability to investigate cybercrime. Cyber Command came into being. The CFAA work is still, there's a lot of controversy over the CFAA, particularly from civil libertarians about its alleged misuse and abuse by the Department of Justice, and so that sort of stood in the way of the CFAA reforms. But this is more or less where things landed. A very laissez-faire, again, approach to cybersecurity. In fact, so concerned with this laissez-faire approach was the Obama administration that it ended up doing everything it could to avoid any perception that this voluntary approach could ultimately become mandatory. So there was a very hard pivot again towards this laissez-faire approach. Now, if you fast forward, to 2016, end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, this is what's happened to that ideological context that I mentioned. It was in place at the beginning of the Obama administration, and arguably even going back to 1997. Gone is this presumption of good faith and confidence on the part of big tech. We have, in the first instance, the Russia's interference in the election in 2016 as the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back on this. It destroyed the left's presumptions here, and in its place now you see this rise in the left of sort of the sense that big tech is anti-competitive. It's a big business just like other big businesses. In other words, it's this idea of good faith is gone. There's this arrogance that's perceived, and that in some cases companies have built products or services that they now can't control, right? So there's like this perception that Facebook or pick your company to pick on, sort of a Dr. Frankenstein. And on the right, you still see this traditional anti-government sentiment, but it's really given way in a pretty extraordinary way to also the sentiment that big tech is anti-competitive. But what really sets the center right off and the far right off is this perception that that tech is, particularly social media platforms, are hostile to conservatives, and more broadly that Silicon Valley, whether it's a social media platform or another tech company outside of the social space, comprises this axis of elites. That's what Steve Bannon called Silicon Valley. The other two axes of elites, if you're interested, are, according to Steve Bannon, are Wall Street and Hollywood. So Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and Hollywood comprise this axis of elites that are drawing conservative backlash. And so together we have techlash, which is where we are today. And then when you overlay China on top of that, this helps explain, a bunch of the actions we've seen away from this laissez-faire approach towards a much more regulatory approach to dealing with tech. New export control law was passed 2 years ago, along with CFIUS reforms. We see sanctions coming out of this administration against Chinese tech companies. We see the antitrust investigation announced today against Google, California's privacy law, the IoT law, and so on and so forth. And so, we're in this moment where, whoops, I'm going to stop that. So we're now in this moment where, this kind of coincidental bipartisan consensus over laissez-faire is gone. We can start to see some elements step in its place. Antitrust is one. And I think, dealing with China is another one. And the task for the next administration is to is to consolidate this developing zeitgeist into a more affirmative, forward-looking vision for how we in the United States govern digital risk. And in addition to I think putting tech at risk in terms of citizens' willingness to continue to accept innovation at the pace that they've accepted it so far, is China, which I mentioned, in the title, and I want to sort of end on China. My view is our biggest challenge when it comes to China's rise in the technology marketplace is the fact that we don't have a coherent vision for digital governance. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the TikTok example, WeChat, Huawei, these cases involve a set of sort of digital native risks, data protection, cybersecurity, and the argument is that foreign influence of a company compounds those risks. That's the basic argument, right? The problem is we without a clear vision for what that baseline is, it's really hard for us to articulate how much foreign influence compounds those risks. And because it's hard for us to articulate that delta, that difference between how much foreign influence compounds those risks and what that baseline level of acceptable risk is, I think it's proven really hard for us to identify what our proportional policy intervention is. Is it banning a company from the U.S. marketplace? Is it something less extreme? It's hard to say. And I think the result is we're sort of in this whack-a-mole mode with China that I think is ultimately counterproductive and not likely to achieve the kinds of economic and security outcomes that I think we need as a country. So why don't I stop there? We've got 5 minutes left. I'm happy to answer questions in the time that we have left, if there are any. So Brian, over to you.
Sounds good. Let's look in the Q&A here and see if anyone has any questions. I don't see any immediately, but let me ask a question.
Sure.
I think we've seen some degree of protectionism, right, in American tech in the past. You think about how the Trump administration responded to TikTok, or if you think about Huawei coming out of China and there's some degree of barring them from government contracts and the like. Do you have any thoughts in terms of kind of international tech companies and how that relationship kind of plays out in the future?
So I think Europe, has had a major evolution, I think, in its attitude towards China. And I don't want to, I don't want to reduce the diversity of Europe to Europe, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's easier. That's a little for shorthand. So please forgive the broad brushstrokes. But I mean, as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. So when I was in the White House, I used to get updates from our negotiating team in the TTIP negotiations with Europe. That was the trade negotiation that was under negotiation at the time on the digital aspects of the negotiation. And they would tell me that when the going would get tough, their counterparts in the European Commission, their counterpart trade negotiators, would joke, "Oh, hey, if you don't cut a deal with us, we'll just go cut a deal with China." And we were always a little bit like, "Wow, like careful what you ask for." Well, that attitude's changed a lot, and I think it's because of both. I think the rise of sort of the digital single market in Europe, where they're thinking more holistically about the digital market and what what that looks like in the future and how foreign companies can play. There are some big European tech companies that are competitive, but most of them are here in the United States or increasingly in China. And there's also, I think, a growing concern about the influence and direction of the Chinese Communist Party and its influence over companies domiciled in China. You see this reflected. Sweden announced the other day that they were going to ban Huawei from their networks. And Sweden is a very reputation for being a very level-headed, middle-of-the-road, pragmatic country. And so it's really shifted. I think I think right now in the U.S. at least, at a strategic level, we're struggling to articulate not only what a coherent sort of vision for digital governance is, but gosh, what is the vision for U.S.-China relations? And I don't think we have any. There's a lot of debate about this. And a lot of I think unanswered questions about both what we want out of the relationship as well as what the Chinese want out of the relationship.
Thank you. That makes sense. I'm mindful of time. We have about 2 minutes, so I'm going to ask you kind of the last two questions. Maybe I'll combine them. One person asks, are our elections safe from foreign influence? And maybe related to that, which candidate is better positioned to take the next steps that you propose? And we'll end on those if
sure.
Can answer either or both.
Yeah, I'll do both quickly. So are elections safe from foreign influence? No, unfortunately.
That's a yes.
Full stop. That's an easy one. In terms of which candidate is better positioned to take the next steps, I think, let me close this. So, this administration does not have a strong track record of strategic thinking and long-term planning. It's when you have a president who does policy by tweet, it's hard to do. So in that sense, I think a Biden administration would have a lot more success. I think that in a second Trump term, I think he would be very tempted to cut a deal with China. I know there's a lot of churn and angst now about this administration's attitude toward China, but if I had to predict, I think Trump is going to find it irresistible to not cut a deal with China. Now, what that deal looks like, whether it's meaningful, I think is a separate question. But in terms of turning the temperature down in the U.S.-China relationship, at least temporarily, I think Trump is probably more likely to do that, both by disposition, but also politically. He'd be in a stronger position to sell a deal to his base, who will believe anything he says, and Republicans won't criticize him. He doesn't care about Democrats. Whereas Biden, any deal he cuts with China, is going to get attacked on both the left and the right. So it depends. You want a short-term, sugar sweetener, or do you want, to eat your veggies and, I would say Biden is veggies, Trump is sugar.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for that. I thought it was a very insightful talk and a great historical context. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian. Take care, everyone.